Welcome. So my name is Dexter Thillien. I'm a lead analyst for Technology and Telecoms at the Economist Intelligence Unit. Thank you very much for Autodesk for inviting us to the event. So Economist Intelligence Unit is part of the Economist group, but I'm not a journalist, so you don't have to worry about anything being in the newspaper this week or next week. We're all between friends here. Nothing you will say will be up here on print. So there we are. Let's talk about AI. As you can imagine, AI is a big part of my research world over the past 2.5 years. There we are. Can we please put the timer, because I have the tendency to talk too long, so I just need to know that I don't talk too long. And if you don't, that's fine. You just have to stop me at some point. So let's start with the first thing to do with AI. Money. You can make your own Pink Floyd or ABBA joke. It's up to you. But there we are. Money. What's happening? A lot of people are spending an awful lot of money. Not a surprise, but this is a chart that I'm using. Is good, thank you. On a quarterly basis, when I look at the big tech companies and the results, is it me? I know I have the name of a serial killer, so I scare people sometimes, so sometimes I scare a microphone too, probably. I'll just shout, that's fine. So this is a chart that I'm using on a regular basis to see the CapEx and the results and everything. And you can see I'm using the big four, so everybody apart from Apple, so Alphabet/Google, Amazon, Meta/Facebook, and Microsoft, in terms of what they're planning to spend and what they're spending. So the dark blue and the red are what they've been spending in 2023 and 2024, and the light blue is what they expected to spend in 2025, so up to $100 billion if you're AWS. In total, it's over $320 billion. It was $245 billion in 2024. So it's a lot of money. And they're doubling down. So if you look at the Q1 result, they're all saying, we're still going to spend the money we said we were going to spend. If you're Meta, you're actually spending a tiny bit more than they were planning to spend. And they spend quite a lot in the first quarter as well. So there's a lot of money to be spent. And the reason they're spending all that money is that all of them are saying one thing. Yes, we have an awful lot of demand, and supply can't really keep up so far. This is why we need to invest even more. This is why we need to buy more chips. This is why we need to build more data center. This is why we need to do all of these things. So that's only one element, because this is kind of corporate tech companies. You also see things happening from government. Donald Trump was in the Middle East. He's announced an awful lot of different contracts over the last week in Qatar, Saudi Arabia, and UAE. Again, same thing. Data centers, chips, all those companies, but not just in the Middle East. In the US, Stargate, $500 billion until 2028. In Europe, European Commission, 200 billion euros, which is about $210 billion, also spending on infrastructure and supercomputing. France, 109 billion euros, so about $150 billion, again, on infrastructure and data center. Even yesterday, France announced another deal for $17 billion, again, about building more infrastructure. So we're seeing everybody spending an awful lot of money, because everybody wants to be ahead with AI, and infrastructure is there. So the infrastructure is there, is being built. You can do an awful lot on top of it. It is there. So that's not the issue. The issue is not the spending. The issue is not the infrastructure. The issue is not the lack of capabilities. But what is the issue? Is there is one. Its adoption remains pretty low. So this is data from Eurostat. They do that every year. So this is for 2024. And what they show for 2024 is that only about 30.5% of EU firms were using AI, which is quite low if you think about it. There obviously is a lot of differences depending on the country. If you're talking in a country like in Scandinavia or even in the Netherlands and in Belgium, it's closer to 20-25%. So that's pretty good. If you're Romania, it's only 3%. Not brilliant. Probably could do better. 13% is actually almost twice as it was in 2023. It was around 7%. So it's gradually increasing, but probably not increasing to a very high level. And it's also the difference in terms of the size of companies. So if you're talking about what the Eurostat calls large companies, so companies with over 250 employees, you're moving to over 40% of companies using AI. If you're talking about small companies, it's only about 10%. So this is quite important in there. But the adoption is quite low. So there's two ways to look at it. Only 13% of companies are using AI. What are you doing? Or 86.5, yes, I think that's right, of companies are not using AI. There's an awful lot of opportunities going there for everybody to jump into that bandwagon. And this is one of the slides that actually Christian quite liked in terms of what's happening in terms of industry. So this is kind of the same data, but looking at adoption by industry. So same average, 35%, and then we're looking at the different sector. Not a surprise, the tech sector is on top, only about 50%, which to me seems quite low, but there we are in terms of the methodology. But I think it's quite interesting in terms of the sectors that Autodesk is looking at, or what you're looking into the room, which is kind of construction and manufacturing. Construction is at the top or the bottom, depending on how you want to look at it. Only 6% of companies are using AI, manufacturing just 10%. So both of them being under the EU average. What does that mean? You can be pessimistic and say only 6% of construction companies are using AI. That's not great, but I think in my view, it means that 94% of companies are not using it. Therefore, there's probably a lot of room to grow. And I think the issue is about 94% of companies not being convinced by AI or by technology. I think it's more, a lot of those companies want to use AI, but they're not entirely sure where to go and how to start. And this is what we're going to be discussing around that track. So let's be positive and say, if I come back next year, or if you do something similar next year, will be much higher numbers in there, but still with a lot of room to grow. Finally, because we're in Europe, in EU, we have to talk about regulation. I'm sorry. AI Act. I know the Americans are all very pleased every time I talk about regulation. It's something that they're, super keen. European regulation is one thing that American companies tend to enjoy first and foremost. But anyway, AI Act was passed by the EU late 2023, I think. What it does is looking at AI on a risk-based approach. So if you have minimal risk, you don't have a problem, you can launch your product. If you have what they call unacceptable risk, so social scoring and things like that, you can't launch. Whatever you do, you're forbidden from launching. I think what's quite more interesting is what is the high risk. So kind of high risk use cases, which can be anything to do with kind of health, safety, fundamental rights. You need to go through an awful lot of different hoops in order to be able to launch your product into market. Why is it relevant? It's relevant because they started discussing that in 2019, and I don't need to tell you that ChatGPT launched in 2022. So when that happened, they all went, oh, we need to look at generative AI and foundation model because our matrix doesn't really quite work. And therefore, because generative AI can kind of do a multi-purpose model, everything is theoretically high risk. So that's kind of an issue in terms of what they're doing. So the thing that it will do is they're going to launch a code of practice or the code of conduct. Normally this month, I haven't seen it yet, and with the 20th of May, so maybe in the next 10 days, but fairly soon, they're going to launch a code of practice, and they're going to be looking in terms of what exactly are you enforcing those kind of different level of risk. With the new European Commission, we've seen kind of a move from very kind of heavy scrutiny on tech companies in terms of regulation to something that's a bit more favorable to innovation. So maybe we'll see within the same act not a strong scrutiny on regulation. We'll have to wait and see in terms of what they do. But this is what the platform is in terms of the AI Act. The EU will probably have the strictest AI regulation in the world. We're seeing what's happening in the US, where there's actually a bill in the Congress where they're trying to basically get rid of every state laws that are happening, just to have for 10 years. So we'll see whether that goes through Congress in the next year. But this is where we are in terms of regulation in the EU, in terms of if you want to deploy AI in the EU, you need to think about that the same way you've thought about the GDPR and a few other things going forward. So a conclusion, a few key takeaways from me. Corporates and governments are spending an awful lot of money on AI, mostly on infrastructure. That will allow the development of all the applications you can think of and probably more. EU adoption remains quite low on average. As I say, 13%. It's increasing, but it's still fairly low as an absolute number. And it's even lower for industries such as construction and manufacturing, which means that there's even more opportunities and more room to grow. An AI Act, as I say, probably the strictest piece of regulation globally. We'll see how it is enforced, and every time with EU regulation, the proof is in the enforcement. But it is something from every company being in the EU to think about and to consider where you're going to apply AI in your workflow. And with that, thank you very much. And I think I'm giving it to Andy from AWS to discuss what they're doing. There you are, Andy.